I'm going to start off this discussion about the Cold War conflicts, and I apologize for it being a little bit late, but it'll help you with the final exam. So make sure you go through the whole thing. I'm going to start off by trying to set a stage for, let's say, the years of 1950 to 52, 53. And you have to remember that back in 1949 or 48, I forget which, and it doesn't make any difference, the Russians set off their own atomic bomb. The Americans at the end of the Second World War had predicted, it may take 5 years, 10 years for the Russians to figure out how to make this one. But the Americans didn't realize that the Russians had spies at Alamogordo, New Mexico, and other places where the parts of the bomb were made and coming together. So by 1950, the United States was in great fear of the rise of the Soviet Union, or not the rise of, but what they thought to be the perception of the strength of the Soviet Union, and the concept or the idea that there was going to be a world war. Sooner or later, there would be a world war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, in this process, by 1950, what they thought, you also have to remember something else. In 1948, Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War. The government of the United States was blamed by the conservatives for something really stupid, saying, who lost China? Well, nobody lost China. China had a civil war, and the communists came out on the winning side, and the nationalists had to run away to Taiwan. And when they did that, the Americans thought wrongly, a lot of things were thought wrongly at this time, that there was not a conspiracy, but a cooperation between Beijing and Moscow, that all communists were controlled by Moscow. That was the line that they were selling to the world. Not just them. Every non-communist nation suspected such things, and that was never true either. There was cooperation, but that's it. At the end of the Second World War, well, it says here, Japan took over Korea in 1910, and until the end of the Second World War, Japan controlled Korea, north and south. There was no north-south. At the end of the war, the Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel, just south, you can see on the map, of Panmunjom and north of Seoul, Korea, surrendered to the Soviets, and the Japanese south surrendered to the Americans. So the American occupied South Korea, and the Soviets controlled and to some extent occupied North Korea. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces come across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack on South Korea. American troops, only 500 of them there, thought that the Soviets wouldn't fight to, or the Soviets thought that the Americans wouldn't fight to save it, and they had told the dictator of North Korea, go ahead, they won't fight for it, and you can have a reunited Korean peninsula under communist control. Instead, the Americans sent everything they could to Korea, and by 1950, well, you can see here, first the North Koreans pushed the Americans and the South Korean army all the way back down to perimeter Busan. Then General MacArthur, if you look at the line where you can see where it says Incheon, General MacArthur goes around behind the North Korean troops. At this time, there's no Soviet, or the Soviet advisors and probably some Chinese, but it's the North Korean army. They go behind them and they land at Incheon, where MacArthur was considered a genius for this kind of tactics to get around behind the enemy. And the North Koreans had to retreat north as much as possible, and they were cut off, and hundreds of thousands of North Koreans were taken prisoner. Then MacArthur decides that he's going to launch an attack north of the 38th parallel, and he pushes further and further north until the Chinese said, don't come near the Yalu River, the border between China and North Korea. MacArthur didn't believe it, pushed his troops as far north as he could near the Yalu, and just as it looked like the Americans were going to win the war, 300,000, I've read up to 500,000 Chinese come across the Yalu River, pushed the Americans and the South Koreans back, further back in a winter war, a horrible winter war. In the United States, there's a, I'll show you in a second, a monument to the Korean War. They call it the Forgotten War because it was never taught much when I was a kid. My father went to South Korea during the war, but he stayed there a few months, and because he'd already received 2 silver stars and 3 bronze stars and all kinds of combat awards for heroism in the Second World War, they allowed him to be shipped off. This was a good thing for the family. And he went to Salzburg, Austria, and we joined him in Salzburg, Austria in 1952. I lived there for 5 years. The fight between the North and the South Korea turned into a war, possibility of exploding into a Third World War between the Americans and the Chinese Communists. This is important. It didn't turn into a Third World War. There's never been a peace treaty signed, but when we get to Vietnam, you got to remember, just a few years before, let's say Vietnam starts in 1964, 65 actually, with the Americans, then the Americans have always got this in their mind, that it's the Chinese supporting the North Koreans, and then for the Vietnam War, it's the Chinese communists and the Russian communists sort of supporting Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese. That wasn't really overly true either. They got supplies like the Americans were supplying the South Koreans and also fighting for the South Koreans. The Americans were supplying the South Vietnamese and eventually fighting not for them, but fighting the war in Vietnam. MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, is a character in history in himself. He called for an extension of the war into China. He wanted to drop atomic bombs on Chinese cities to make the Chinese get out of Korea. The President of the United States, Harry Truman, rejected it. Nobody wanted to drop nukes anymore. No one still wants to drop nuclear weapons of any kind. But MacArthur was a great hero, American hero. And Truman said, no, you won't. And MacArthur continued to disobey the president. In the United States, and I'm sure it's in the Peruvian Constitution or the Ecuadorian Constitution, I know, the president of the country is the commander-in-chief. So President Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur on April 1st, April Fool's Day in the United States. MacArthur returns as a great hero, and some people to the American people, because they didn't like Harry Truman firing their great military hero. Most people who study military history and Douglas MacArthur say Harry Truman had no choice, and he did the right thing, because Douglas MacArthur was greatly in love with Douglas MacArthur. There was an armistice signed in 1951, and finally the war stops. It did not. It ended in a stalemate. It ended in an armistice, a ceasefire. 54,000 Americans and $67 billion down the war tube. The Cold War at home. This is very important because it's the idea of what the American people, how they felt about what was going on in the world. And they were being, in my mind, I guess you could say I'm a relative expert on the Cold War. So I've been studying it so much and read so many books and written papers and everything. The Americans were sold what we say in English a bill of goods. They were told that the Russians, you can see the evil-looking Siberia, going off to Siberia with all the laborers, and Stalin down there between the man's legs, and the mean, evil Russians, and they're going to take over the world. And at the height of World War II, 80,000 Americans were members of the Communist Party. And why would they be that way? Well, back in the 20s, and especially by the 30s, with the end of the the beginning of the Depression, a lot of people thought that capitalism, and some people still do in this world, capitalism is a bad system. It's even an evil system that it enslaves the workers, and it's the oligarchy or the capitalists, the owners of capital keep most of the capital and don't share it. That thought's been going on for an awful long time. I would say 150 years since the rise of industrialized Europe and industrial United States, with the rise of the idea of socialism, labor unions, the left, the political philosophies of the left. Some fear that the first loyalty of American communists was to the Soviet Union. That's not necessarily true. There was an American Communist Party, and it was people who believed in what the things I just explained, the left. Then fear of communists, well, the Americans back from before the First World War were afraid, and of course with the Soviet Union, the rise of the Soviet Union, afraid that the communists wanted to expand and take over the world. That's not true either. And if you think about this just for a second, and it's not a place to get into it for a long time, little interruption on the telephone. Think about it this way. Every country in the world, every country has its concept of nationalism. And every country in the world has these ideas about how to socialize their young people. In Ecuador, I've been living here for 25 years. There's a school a little primary school right next to me, and every Monday morning at 7:30 they play the Ecuadorian national anthem. And in the beginning of every baseball game, since we got one more game in the World Series, and the Red Sox will win 4-3 in the whole series, and my heroes will be the Red Sox. We play the national anthem, and then in the middle of the 7th inning of every baseball game, there's the God Bless America. And we all have little America. Some of you have been in the States. Some of you may be American citizens. We have little American flags all over the place. And when something bad happens, we tie yellow ribbons around. And there's a picture there of 2 little Cub Scouts. I used to be a Cub Scout, then I was a Boy Scout, and then by the time I was 14, I was an Eagle Scout. And you pledge allegiance to the flag, and that's true. All countries want their citizens to be loyal to the country. By 1947, I would call it the beginning of the Red Scare. The government started investigating the loyalty of all government employees, including military. My father told me that he had to take a loyalty oath. When I went in the military in 1965, one of the reasons was I had a very high top secret clearance for many, many, many years. And I had to undergo a FBI investigation. I had no history of anything. Maybe didn't even drink in those days. And you have to sign a document that you're not a member of the Communist Party, have never been a member of a Communist Party, and so on. So all countries are kind of like that. I'm sure government employees in Ecuador and Peru have to swear allegiance. In Ecuador, when they're seniors in high school, there's a Jura de Bandera ceremony where they go down on one knee and kiss the tip of the flag, the Ecuadorian flag. Then, by 1947, the House of Representatives comes up with an Un-American Activities Committee, so anybody that's suspected of being a communist or a left-winger, or they believed that communists were sneaking propaganda into Hollywood, was full of propaganda made by the I just noticed a sign being held up. Dalton Trumbo was one of my favorite. He wrote a marvelous book. It's called Johnny Got His Gun. He was a screenwriter in Hollywood. You can find the movie on YouTube. It's a very strong anti-war story. You should get that and watch it sometime. I won't tell you what it's about. It's very, very, very strong movie. End story. But they're investigating people who work in government, they're investigating Hollywood people, they're investigating the media, they're investigating people who write books and everything to see if there's any leftist sentiment. Then they blacklisted people, 10 witnesses. They brought them up before the Congress and they would say, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party or having sympathies for communism? And in the United States, according to our Constitution, you can say, I plead the Fifth Amendment, which means I don't have to answer your question, because if I do, I might incriminate myself. And you cannot force someone to, in testimony, legal testimony, to incriminate themselves. So because these people didn't answer the question, they put them in jail on the assumption that they were guilty, when they may or may not have been guilty, but they didn't have to answer the question. And if they don't answer the question, you can't put them in jail on that kind of thing. Subsequently, 500 actors, directors, writers, producers whom they thought were leftists. Now if they put every leftist in Hollywood in jail today, there wouldn't be anybody left, because Ronald Reagan's dead. And then they had this little guy on the left. His name was Richard Nixon. And he was on the right, and President Eisenhower was Republican, and Nixon's a Republican, which has always been on the right of the political spectrum. And he found some evidence. It was not true, but they said what they wanted to say. And Richard Nixon became very famous because he was prosecuting a guy that he said was Alger Hiss, was a government employee. And they found him guilty on questionable evidence. And a couple years later, Nixon becomes the Vice President of the United States based on his reputation of hunting for the Reds. And then there were Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who had worked on the atomic bomb and sent the information to the Russians because they were Jewish. I think a lot of it had to do with that. I did some studies on this because both of their sons were my professors in college at Western New England University in Massachusetts years ago. They were executed for being spies and giving traitors. They were found guilty of treason. Then along comes Joseph McCarthy. There's a whole period in American history, 52 to 54, something like that. It's called the McCarthy period, the McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy was an alcoholic senator from Wisconsin. And to get his picture in, as you can see, in newspapers and magazines and on the news, on the radio mostly, people even in the early 50s, not everybody had televisions, but he claimed that he had a list. I have in my hand a list of, I forget how many, 205. Now I had a list of 40-something, but eventually unsupported claims of 205 members of the State Department were communists. There was never any list. He never proved anything. General Eisenhower, then President Eisenhower, was criticized because he didn't come down harder on the senator who was running around saying the communists we're surrounded by communists within our own government and stuff like that. These are examples of the anti-communist propaganda. They made a lot of movies like Aliens movies. I was thinking of one where the aliens come and they land and they have like in pods, like if you know how peas come, peas don't come in a can, they come in pea pods, and you open up the peas and there's the pea pods. Well, the aliens come in pods and they lay their pods and they grow, and all of it was an analogy or a metaphor for the communists are coming. It's a very funny movie about the commies are coming or something like that, landing a submarine on the beach of Massachusetts, and the people from the little town go out and they make good friends with the Soviet sailors and help them get their submarine off before the American Navy comes and sinks because people are just people. Then McCarthy's downfall, finally he was accusing generals in the army of being communists, and finally he accused General George C. Marshall, who was the senior U.S. military officer in the Second World War, later became Secretary of State, and one of the most noble gentlemen the United States produced in the 20th century. He accused him of being weak on communists too, and maybe a secret sympathizer, and that was the end of him. But he was an alcoholic, and he died at 49 years old. Today, the congressional witch hunts and episodes of red baiting. What's the big scandals right now? There's an organization called NSA, the National Security Agency, and they have been listening to phone calls and emails. And oh, by the way, everything that you use in the internet and everything you use on your iPhones, smartphones, whatever you want to call them, it all is out there in the cloud. The cloud's nothing new. And governments are listening, not just the United States, and it's been going on. I went and interviewed for a job with NSA about 75 or 76. And the job was spying on other countries. All countries spy on other countries. The Ecuadorians spy on Peruvians, and the Peruvians spy on the Ecuadorians, and the Bolivians, and the Chilenos. It's nothing new. They've only been doing it for about since Ooga Booga and Betty Buddha lived in a cave and they were watching the neighbors see what they were doing. Somebody's always got their nose in somebody else's business. Nothing new at all. Today, the congressional witch hunts and episodes of red baiting are universally discredited as an abuse of power. Well, that's what power is. You need to know what the intentions of the potential enemy are. The history of the blacklist is one of demagoguery, censorship, and political despotism. Non-democratic nations, authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorships, and I could make a list. China, North Korea in particular. One of my friends right now, the guy who's in charge of the Broward International Program, he's in China right now. You don't have, you can't use, what is it you call Instagrams and no tweeters and no twits and email is censored. I read an article today in Foreign Affairs magazine. China has 1.5 million military people. They have 2 million internet watchers, censoring and blocking and checking to see who's talking to who and who's. They call them keyword watchers. That's what they do. Nothing new. Two nations, we live on the edge. At the top is a hydrogen bomb. In the picture on the left is the Bikini Bomb of Pacific Ocean 1954. The U.S. begins working on a bomb 67 times stronger than Hiroshima. And they built it. Even the people who worked on the Hiroshima bomb were shocked by the power of a hydrogen bomb and said we shouldn't produce such things. But if you don't, the other guy's going to do it too. And then brinkmanship. Brinkmanship means like one up. If you read carefully about the reasons for the First World War, one of them was the battleship war between Germany and Great Britain. One would build a big battleship with a big gun. Maybe the guns on it had 14-inch barrels, meaning the 14-inch shell could come out and fire, let's say, 15 miles. So the other country builds a bigger gun that's 14.5 inches, and they can fire 19 miles. And then the other one, and they did the same thing with the rockets. My rocket's bigger than yours. It sounds like little boys. My daddy can beat up your daddy, and always this competition. My rocket. So rocket competition becomes bigger. It's called throw power. What is the weight that the rockets can lift into space to fire from the Soviet Union to the United States? And it shows a picture here. I think it's kind of funny because Americans were building nuclear bomb shelters. And my father decided about 1958 when he finally retired from the Army and he built it. We bought a farm in the mountains of upstate New York. So we're going to build a bomb shelter. So they got the tractor come in. And I helped him lay the cement and build the thing. It was like, I think, 3 meters of cement on top of this hole in the ground. And in the ground was what you can see there. There was never a nuclear war. The only use of the bomb shelter was that you had a lock on the inside of the door. So as I got to be a teenager, and I'm sure you remember what teenagers think about. Boys think of girls and girls think of boys. So it was a great place to take my girlfriend down into the bomb shelter because I could lock the door from the inside. And my brother and sister and her brothers, they knew where we were, but they couldn't bother us because we were in the bomb shelter. And later my mother stored canned food down there, which I don't know, it's probably still there. And then the CIA. Well, that's a whole different story. I've been listening to I listen to recorded CDs on my way to work and back every day, and I'm listening to one now of how incompetent the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was then, ever since then, and probably today too. As the Cold War heated up, the CIA is created, and they wanted to overthrow governments. It becomes a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union of who had what countries favorable to their system of government. Of course, the Russians, they controlled from the Baltic, Stettin in the Baltic, as Truman said, to Trieste in the Adriatic, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, what's south of Romania, etc. The United States doesn't really, they have a power over, let's put it that way. So it become here in the Middle East, one of the first covert operations occurred in the Middle East because of what? There's oil in the Middle East. I don't care what you're going to major in colleges and universities. You should understand the history of petroleum. There's a wonderful video. It's a long documentary. You'll find it on YouTube. It's called The Prize. You can also find the book. It's written by Daniel Yergin. I've read the book a couple of times, and I don't know how many times I've watched The Prize, to understand why major industrial countries in this world who have to depend on petroleum products, they will do the things they shouldn't do. The United States got rid of the, I don't think it's so much pro-Russian, I guess you could call him a dictator, threw him out and put in this guy, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the Shah of Iran. And he liked fancy clothes. He didn't buy those in Walmart. And then you had, possibly left-leaning governments, is the only way I can put it, in Central America. So in 1954, the CIA makes a program to overthrow the government of the left-leaning government, not necessarily pro-Soviet, but left-leaning. Well, what did left-leaning mean? What it really meant was, here's a government, in Guatemala in particular, there's a lot of bananas. And who owned it was the United Fruit Company. And who were on the board of directors of the United Fruit Company was the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the CIA. So they're on the board of directors of this big banana company, and the government is saying we're going to do land reform. Land is going to be taken away from the rich companies and the rich people and given to the poor. And I do know that Peru has gone through these same kind of things, and so has Ecuador over the centuries, and Colombia and everybody. And Chavez was very popular. Take it away from the big guys and give it to the little guys. Unfortunately, utopia just doesn't work. The actions failed eventually. The military dictator rose to power, but he was a right-wing dictator. He was a friend of the United States. I would put this on an exam for you. The Central Intelligence Agency was not a secret. It's a joke. Some Central Intelligence Agency, everything they tried. When we get to Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, Castro was almost sitting on the beach smoking a cigar waiting for him to land so he could blow them all up, and killed like 300 and captured another 1,100 wounded and so on. This is a map to look at what NATO is, and you can see I'm colorblind, so I don't know. The Western countries are one color and the Eastern countries are another. Bulgaria is the one I couldn't think of, and Albania. I'll take a guess. The ones on the right I think are a reddish color. The ones on the left I don't know. I really don't. So you can get an idea how Europe is divided. And then in 1956, the Hungarian people rise up against the Soviets. the Soviet power, the Soviets controlling their country, the Americans, and the British too, instigated this uprising, and they wanted free elections and an end to Soviet domination. The Soviets came in with the tanks and the machine guns, and the United States did nothing about it, backed away completely, and it was a false promise. The space war, very quickly. I mentioned before about the throw power of rockets. It was very important in those days. Who was building bigger rockets? And where did the rocket scientists come from? The Soviet Union captured some Nazi rocket scientists because they're the ones that were ahead of everybody else. And the other ones went to the United States, including the chief of the rocket science project in this Nazi Germany. His name was Werner von Braun. And they went to Huntsville, Alabama, and started building the American rockets, and the Soviets were building their rockets out in a place called Novosibirsk in Siberia. And in 1957, the Americans didn't even know that the Russians could do this. They put a satellite, a very small satellite, bigger than a basketball, but not much bigger, and all it had in it was a transmitter with some antenna, as you can see, but it was a tremendous shock to the United States. Sputnik was what it was called. Traveled around the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour, and you could even see it if you were where we lived, way up in the mountains. If you had good binoculars, on a clear night, you could actually see this shiny thing going past if you knew what the trajectory was. And then the CIA built something called a U-2 plane to fly over the Soviet Union so they could take pictures, always spying. Now they don't need to. You've got the satellite sitting up there. But an amazing airplane. It was succeeded by the SR-71, which is another. I'm an airplane fanatic since I was a little kid. And they could take pictures of everything flying from Iran. Back in those days, Iran were buddies. And they would fly from Iran up over to the Soviet Union, over Moscow, or over. They knew where the Soviet Union had rockets. They knew where the airfields were, so they were always keeping an eye on them. Of course, violating Soviet airspace. And in May of 1960, one of the U-2s was shot down, and Francis Gary Powers was captured by the Soviet Union, and it messed up a meeting that Khrushchev and Eisenhower were going to meet in Paris. It was called off, but they couldn't do that anymore. Francis Gary Powers eventually was traded. And that was the 1950s. It was a very, very tense period. And in a little bit, we'll get to the 1960s and tell you some even more tenseness.